Hello everyone, it is Joe here from Omnipoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the stuff from Chilling Reign, make sure you go ahead and check out the old Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code Omnipoke. For today's video, we are going to be doing a tier list of Chilling Reign. There's a ton of interesting archetypes, and I've taken some of those brand new ones that I'm expecting to try and make a foothold in the metagame and discuss how I think they'll be interacting with some of the other top archetypes that we have come to know. I've gone ahead and got the 20 best performing decks from Trainer Hill and bung them in here alongside some of those new contenders. So I'm going to go ahead and try and pick a sort of baseline for each of these tiers to sort of give you a definition for my own opinion of these tiers, and then we can start talking about some of the newer decks as well. So really just a quick rundown. Tier S decks, there may not even be any Tier S decks in a single format. The way I foresee it is it's one of the top contenders that doesn't have any obvious counters, and its worst matchups are like 40% matchups, and they're still winnable. Tier 1 decks have some of the highest power level, good consistency, and are counterable, so they can take bad matchups here or there. Tier 1.5 decks have a high power level, sometimes are crippled by some awkward matchups, or have less consistency to them. Tier 2 decks are either very consistent but a slightly lower power level, or they're at that medium to high power level but are less often working. And Tier 3 decks are, they're available, they're options, they're oftentimes a little bit less consistent than others, are trying to target specific matchups and are more sort of meta-dependent style decks where they're not necessarily inherently strong on their own. They're really looking to take advantage of moments in the meta to pounce. That doesn't mean they're not good by any means, and they can still take wins here and there. Everything that we're looking at today have been relatively successful over the last few months in the Battle Styles format, and we'll probably still see an amount of play in the Chilling format. So let's get ADP out the way first. I think this is the only Tier S deck in this metagame. It's a awkward thing to say, but some of the best new decks coming out from Chilling Reign. Calyrex is weak to Dark, and even with the introduction of things like Aurora Energy and Zapdos, you still have to draw into those pieces, which means you need to still make Calyrex a multiple of them to draw through your deck, and that means that you can fall prey to the Eternatus matchup, and there may be some other dark style decks coming out as well. Things like Survivor, things like Spiritomb coming out, which will be awkward matchups for the Ghost Rider, so I can't really put that in Tier S. The Ice Rider obviously has Metal Weakness, and there's a few other new VMAXs out here, but I don't think they quite touch the power level of the Calyrex sort of duo that we're getting. So I think we can only really call ADPZ the unique Tier S deck because realistically, its worst matchups are only like that 40% range. We know that it can sometimes struggle with some of the fire archetypes, especially with things like the Rapidash coming into the Victini deck. That can be a little bit more awkward. They can tag the ADP quite early with a substantial amount of damage and set up things like the regular Victini V and Heatran and stuff like that little bit more often. But I still think that in general, that's super winnable. I think things to bear in mind going forward into Chilling Reign meta, possibly going up from 1 swell to 2 is going to be important because of Path to the Peak style archetypes. There's the option for Peony to be like a way to build ADP, of course, because this allows you to cherry pick a couple item cards. It means that you could move towards having Echoing Horn in the deck, as well as going back to 1 to 2 Great Catchers. Also having the option to just Peony for like double Saucer in the late game. In the early game, allowing you to get Saucer E-Switch or some like switch combinations and what have you, I think is very solid. So I think ADP, as we know it right now, will remain very strong, but it gains additional options. Echoing Horn allows you to ignore your opponents altogether that much more often. It means they have even less wiggle room. They can't research away to Denes and Crobats these days, so it's going to really hinder your opponent's deck. It actually becomes like heavily disruptive just because there's a chance of a Horn losing the game for the opponent straight away. So even if that Echoing Horn is just a 1 count, which I expect it will be for the most part, especially in Peony engines, it will be substantially beneficial to ADP. So I think it will be going out with a bang, really. It is probably what I expect to be the only Tier S deck. I think, it's still one of the most heavily played decks, and it doesn't have the highest amount of wins out there, but it is still an insanely good performer at getting top 8s, top 16s for all sorts of players, and I can foresee that continuing on in the future. Let's have a look at what I would call a tier 1 deck that has already been pre-existing. Eternatus is a really good example of this. Really high power level, very consistent at what it does, but it does take some awkward matchups. Obviously, pre-battle styles, pre-battle styles, it was very, very dominant. And as soon as Rapid Strike came out, it really was a thorn in the side. Not even things like weak gun energy are sufficient these days because, of course, Giratina can be teched into the Urshifu. It's a bit of a back and forth on that front. Things to note for Eternatus going forward is that it gains Galarian Moltres, which I think is really, really excellent for the deck, and again, probably shifts it in a different direction. We have seen things like Power Plant in Eternatus, alongside sometimes Crushing Hammers. I think going forward, we're going to be seeing Galarian Moltres E-Switch being a combination, so we're less ruined by Hammers, which I think is excellent for the game, of course, because less games will be determined just by your opponent's heads and tails flips. And it means that even if you have those awkward turn ones where you don't get an energy drop on your earlier turner, you can still get a turn 2 attack off by finding the combination of Moltres E-Switch attachments, as well as like the VMAX and all that other stuff. It's a bit of a cavalcade to get it working, but it's possible. Whereas previously, if you just don't turn 1, get an energy drop on Eternatus, you know that there's no actual way that you can get that turn 2 attack off outside of Power Accelerator. So yeah, that Eternatus is getting a lot cleaner and less vulnerable to hammers. I think it moves more towards the direction of a Mega Ray from the past, where it just does become the beatdown pace setter deck of the format, and I think that's a perfect spot for it. It enjoys the fact that Ghost Rider is coming out in the format because it's really a foil to Urshifu, and that's going to be very good for Eternatus. So I think it's going to be an absolutely fine spot. At the same time, with potentially less Urshifu, you're also capitalizing on the Ghost Rider. So there is a small triangle that you can think of. Obviously, the Ghost Callies, some of them could be playing things like Mewtwo, which aren't weak to Dark, and they can also play things like Zapdos, Aurora. So those are things to bear in mind. You're not insta-losing as Callie, but it will certainly be awkward. Let's go for a tier 1.5 deck that was pre-existing. And I want to say something like the Psychic Mewtwo sort of goes into this range. It doesn't quite have the consistency of other decks in the format, which puts it within the top 10 of decks right now, but not really following through enough in the game. It is still hurt by Crushing Hammers on its own end. It does have some consistency issues because you play so many one-offs that you need to get into the discard pile, and yeah, that sometimes just doesn't happen. Sometimes they're prized, sometimes you just don't have access to them. So the power level's high. This is also like a fairly meta-dependent style deck. And I think this really was also trying to be that foil to Urshifu. It often plays like hoods as well as like big charms and stuff to get around Mimikyus and stuff like that. So I think this is a good preset zone for tier 1.5, where it's still breaking into that top 10 decks, still has a lot of power behind it, still has a really awkward game plan, but doesn't do it quite as often as the tier 1 decks. One thing I definitely will note is that you could even drop this potentially further going into the Chilling Reign format. So maybe this isn't the best example because right now it's a 1.5, but I'm actually going to drop it lower in the tier list. So I'll find a new 1.5 in a moment. The reason I'm dropping it down to tier 2 in this format, man, am I even dropping this lower? Yeah, I'm actually going to drop... Let's find a new example. I'm going to put this in tier 3, only because Mewtwo is much less of a viable main attacker in the format when Ghost Rider becomes a thing. And also, any deck that's trying to use this Gengar, Mimikyu, Trevnoir package probably should be the Ghost Rider deck because they get to draw more cards. So, although it was a tier 1.5 and my reasoning was there for the Battle Stars format, it's actually not where it is now. So let's find a new pre-existing 1.5 style deck that I don't think is going to be changing too much. Okay, let's look at Blounds or Cracephalon, Tempozard, whatever you want to call it. This is a 1.5 deck because, again, it has that power available to it. It has huge swing turns available, but it just doesn't come off all the time. It's solidly a top 10 deck. I still think it's one of the best one-prize archetypes that is available in the format, and that's not going to change too much. Things to bear in mind is that Ice Rider becomes a thing, which makes the aggressive Zard not really an option. Also, part of the peak becomes a threat for you. Obviously, they're naturally bouncing your stadium, which you always hate to see, but they are going to be denying things like Oricorio, things like Dedenne in the late game, so trying to combine Path and Stamp will be really, really awkward for you to deal with. And just that water-type coverage, especially for the Inteleon, actually. The Ice Rider, potentially not so much, but Inteleon VMAX getting the regular Rapid Strike Inteleon could be even more aggressive into Jirachi plays and stuff like that, and can set up knockouts on Blacephalon over a couple turns whilst hitting pressure onto other Pokemon. It also means they can now one-shot things like Oricorio with the 20 damage ping and gusting them up and stuff like that. So yeah, I think that matchup gets a little bit weaker. Don't think too many other matchups get too awkward for you. I think you don't appreciate hand-locking builds of Ghost Cali, where they can try and hit you with Marnie plus Trevnoir, or they can go for Jesse James, Trevnoir plays, that sort of thing. So those are definitely things to be concerned about, but I think the natural raw power of this archetype keeps it around that 1.5 range. Let's try and find a tier 2 deck. I think Decidueye is a good place to just lay our hat on tier 2. Really meta dependent. It takes L's, it takes hard wins here and there. Things to bear in mind about the new format. Ghost Calyrex, the regular V, is able to place 5 counters onto 2 Pokemon, so that archetype doesn't need to tech for you and can still be annoying and have a ton of sprinkle going on. Also, the regular Calyrex has a 1 for 10 option that denies stadiums coming into play as well as special energy, and Decidueye is kind of known for playing lots of special energy. Of course, that can change. Taking out captures and stuff like that really does hurt you quite a bit for the early game consistency of getting that early Snorlax developed, getting your like multiple Rowlets down. So you may still play those captures, but feel a little bit weaker against Ghost Horse because when they start just poking you for that 10 pressure, they deny firstly a stadium, which is sometimes important for Decidueye if you play Viridian or if you play the Turffield Stadium to get your Decis into play. Both of those being denied is a little bit awkward for you because you try and play low basic energy count, and it means that they can power up towards the sprinkle of 5 counters around the board, which is a very scary option. Are there any other awkward decks from the new set that is going to be trouble for you? I don't think so too much. Possibly Single Strike Survivor, but that's not going to be hugely popular, I don't think. So outside of Ghost Rider decks, I think you should still have a relatively samey matchup spread. I still feel like people will disrespect it enough that it's going to be okay. Phoebe's obviously a thing. Eternatus may not be playing Phoebe anymore because Moltres can get through Zamazenta a little bit easier. They still don't one-shot Zamas, but we'll see on that front. It's kind of, Decidueye is always that wait-and-see game and tries to come out and win tournaments when the meta's favorable for it. So yeah. All right, so now that I've defined these tiers and slightly messed up on this one, let's start talking about some of the newer decks. I've already mentioned Ghost Cali like quite a lot, so let's cover one of the builds first. I'm going to talk about a sort of straight Ghost Cali that's playing Gengar Mimikyu for early game GX attack plays with Horror House, and sometimes teching Trevnoir, not guaranteed to play Trev, and also having like Zapdos Aurora. This is the build that I've tested the most. I think it's the most secure matchup spread where with the double Zapdos and Auroras you have a win condition against Eternatus. The Horror House is cheesy as hell and has a lot of, you gain a lot of time, and as long as you can build multiple horses with that time, you then become really difficult to beat. You have a very robust comeback mechanic just by drawing so many cards to find your bosses to end the game and stuff like that, even if you are Marnied or stamped. And I think this is going to be my favorite way to play the deck. I think definitely tier 1 for me from how I've tested it so far. It does offer 2 easy 3-prize Pokemon to knock out, where you're going to have the Gengar, that can get one shot in this format a decent amount of the time, surprisingly by a good amount of things because it's only at 240 hit points, and then Calyrex can get hit, and yes, of course, you can be like ballooning and switching around these sorts of cards to try and force bosses, but naturally you present 2 3-prize Pokemon in most matchups, and I think that's the biggest thing that's a little bit awkward. You can try and skew that prize trade naturally with the things like Zapdos and alike, and because Echoing Horn is a card, people may try and pick out their own prize map for a few different archetypes like Urshifu, ADP, Victini. They could all be playing Echoing Horn now and just try and shrug and ignore certain targets. So that is something to bear in mind. That's really the only thing that I've felt as a downside for this deck so far. Otherwise, I feel like draws an insane amount of cards, is disruptive in the early turns, has good cheese factor, just like we saw with this Mewtwo variant that's was tier 1.5 in the Battle Stars format. I think it has that like oops you lost kind of mentality where they just have too many trainers in their opening hand, you Horror House and insta punish, and it has the Trevnoir option. Now the one thing I would say about an Aurora base build that's making the space for the Zapdos, probably not too much space for disruption, possibly like one Trevnoir, one Jesse James at most. You can have more disruptive base builds, and I think that's where the sort of Mewtwo package is going to try and lie, where you have the Mewtwo that does the early Horror House and then moves into Trevnoir itself. That can certainly be a thing. I think it's slightly less consistent than straight Ghost Cali. And also that matchup might be a little bit worse for you because you can just sometimes start a Mewtwo and that's really awkward. If you're having to play things like Jirachi GX as well, that's another awkward thing that fills your board with easier prizes for the mirror match and stuff like that. So I think the Mewtwo is a watered down build of just like straight Ghost Cali. I do believe it's a good enough attacker in its own right. That said, Mewtwo is versatile. You can tech it to heck based on what you think other tier 1 decks are. The Mewtwo build can still play Auroras if need be, but it's really getting tight on space at that point. You may even trim down the Ghost Rider count from like a 4-4 to a 3-3 or something like that. I'm always against that idea because it's the same concept of Zoroarks where more the better in play, essentially. So yeah, I think Cookie Cutter is going to be the best way to play this archetype and use exactly Horror House as your GX attack. But a Mewtwo sort of versatile package, I think, will still be in the format. And will still be quite strong. So yeah. Next up, let's have a look at Ice Rider. For me, I feel like the best way to play Ice Rider is going to be with an Inteleon package. I believe this is going to be a tier 2 deck. I'm still concerned by its weakness, of course. There's ADP, but there's also Lucmetal. Both will have a presence in the format, no doubt. And it's hard to see beyond that. But there are some great points about the Ice Rider Cali alongside the Inteleon line. Obviously, playing Intel gives you access to Drizzile, which helps you get, Melanie for turn 2 plays, so you can get full value from its attacks. You can use your discards aggressively to take knockouts on evolving V Pokemon, very similar to how Victini VMAX plays, where if you're the player going first, you attach to an Ice Rider. That is an extremely threatening prospect. But it's not only the case for V Pokemon, also tag teams are super scared by this, because if you can build into Inteleon in time, you can do that 250, push stuff to the back, and then just like ping down that tag team that you hit earlier on in the game a couple times with the Rapid Shooter. So that's also really, really scary. And obviously late game into tag team matchups, you can 250 plus 1 Inteleon ping. So Ice Rider is going to be really nice at pushing away tag teams from the format that little bit more. Makes me feel things like Pikarom and stuff get a little bit more vulnerable in that later game. And obviously when you're playing the thick Drizzile package, you're not super worried about opposing Path of the Peaks. You may be able to squeeze 1 or 2 into your list. I haven't. I've kept 2 separate builds where I've got the Inteleon sort of aggressive approach, but then I've also got like a Path of the Peak, slow the opponent down type of build. I think trying to merge them does get a little bit confusing and a little bit inconsistent. So I'm a little bit wary of that. I do think a lot of people will try just like a turn 1 path style approach to this because it's a low maintenance VMAX, similar to how we could see Victini do a similar thing where you just go heavy on the VMAX line and have a ton of paths to slow the opponent down. But yeah, I think this is my favorite way to play Ice Rider right now. The weakness is obviously a thing, and I still foresee ADP and Lucmetal to be, at least 10% of the field in both respects. So that's the main concern. But the power is certainly there, and don't sleep on the tempo that this deck actually provides. It can be, in certain matchups, even higher tempo than Victini VMAX because they can't leave things like the Dedenne in the active and stuff like that would tank a VMAX. And they can't leave like one prize Pokemon in the active because even their first attack, if your opponent has filled their bench, can take the one shot. You can discard 1 Water Energy and do a solid 130 base. So yeah, this is a really, really threatening archetype. Sets tempo very nicely. And the Rapid Shooters are really great math fixes for the mid to late game. So solid archetype. The weakness really does hurt. I'm not a fan of playing weak guards because it only fulfills the attack of... It only helps fulfill the first attack, not the second. So that's where it falls down. But otherwise, so many good things about that card. It ticks so many boxes, it's actually insane, but that times 2 weakness is still making me a little bit worried. Let's quickly get the Path of the Peak build out the way then. Since I've said that I prefer the rapid shooting build, I feel like a quad Path of the Peak style approach is a little bit slow. You may still need to play Inteleon as your engine. You could also play Chinchino line or just like thick Jirachi sort of package and just try and Stellar Wish towards turn 1 path, which I think is super reasonable. The low maintenance nature of this Cali is quite nice. The only thing I will say is that if you're playing pure Cali compared to like the Inteleon build, you will have to use that second attack that little bit more often aggressively and double discard, which means you to Melanie quite a lot. So you will have to have some sort of backup engine that isn't V and GX based to be able to chain those Melanies. So definitely looking at like Jirachi, Mewtwo, Oranguru style packages, or having Cincino. Those are the real things that I would bear in mind, which comes with their own weaknesses, of course. But yeah, the power of Path of the Peak is super annoying. It will probably force ADP to play double swell, Eterna to play double swell. Ghost Cali is going to play at least 2 Marshadow, I want to say. And because they play comms, fog crystals, quick balls, they have a ton of outs to Path, but sometimes they just don't have it, or they spend their ball search on a Marshadow rather than on a Cali or a Gengar or one of those other cards. So those are all things to bear in mind. The stadium is still super annoying, and it is going to still be a factor in the format for sure. I think that actually Inteleon is also going to be a pretty solid option. Obviously, this was a league battle deck, so I think there'll be a decent amount of people playing this archetype just because of access in IRL play. I don't feel like it's quite good enough to be a tier 1.5 deck, so I'm actually going to put it alongside the Ice Calyrex. It's one of those things where I believe this has more power behind it, but also has some more awkward matchups, whereas the Inteleon has to dodge fewer matchups more often than not, and is a solid baseline deck. So I think I'll probably put this higher in the tier 2 category. Only just, but still kind of the same thing. I do like the rapid shooter pressure that you can add to the 60 damage snipe. You can go one further by having goggles as well as this rapid shooter as well. Yeah, for just really good pressure into the Denes, Crobats, and the like. So that's really nice. Melanie is the biggest buff, really, for the Inteleon going into this new set to try and get that turn 2 max bullet. We tried it so many times with Frostmoth, it was never that consistent. So hopefully Melanie is the way that you can get that really aggressive pressure going. And if you do, you get huge snipe pressure. So very, very solid card there. Let's keep going with some more new decks, I want to say. Let's go for Sandaconda VMAX. Sandaconda VMAX, I'm going to put down in tier 3. I still believe it's outclassed by Rapid Strike Urshifu. It does play a little bit similarly because you are still trying to be snipe pressure, less aggressive, like I will take the prizes on the bench kind of pressure, whereas like you're trying to like grind them down with Sandaconda, which means you're probably having to have some sort of backup draw engine so that you can afford to use Cheryls rather than draw supporters throughout the entire game. So we're looking at Cincinos, we're looking at Pidgeotos to try and get this to work. I actually foresee this playing like a ton of stone fightings and basic fightings at the same time, so you can try and use that 180 damage Kaleidostorm style attack. I do think it's probably going to be a little bit clunkier than most of the archetypes out there right now, and its win condition is more sort of vague, where if your opponent just doesn't overbench, the Sandaconda's really not that threatening, and there are a good amount of VMAXs that can just like 1v1 punch through you without going wide on the board, and naturally Mew's going to be a thing. Ghost Rider is probably playing Mew as well as playing like Rod, so that's awkward because Rod is just a decent card for reloading Psych Energies for late game consistency, or reloading like Zapdos, something like that. So yeah, a few concerns there for the Sandaconda. I think its damage spread, even with like Telescopic, is still a little bit slower than most, and it's going to be just too unconventional overall. All right, let's get some classics in here, I think. Let's go for like current as we know it's Urshifu, where we're playing basic energies, dojos, we're playing scoop up nets, all that good stuff. It's definitely like a tier 1 deck right now. I think it's going to drop down to tier 1.5. Obviously, Ghost Cali is concerning for you, but also I believe there could be better Urshifus on the block. Most notably, I think the Persimmon build with Telescopic Sight will leapfrog the current build that we know, where it's playing Air Balloon and Dojos. You could go towards now Telescopic plus Persimmon to allow yourself access to 180 snipes on the bench, which is just ridiculous pressure. You're still playing the Jirachi package, no doubt, as your main consistency. So in the sort of consistency department, it's going to be very similar. You're just shaking up the stadium usage, you're shaking up the tool usage, and you're adding in the Persimmon. I think that's the real big change. I still like Eternatus, I still like Urshi as an Eterna counter. I think the 180 damage pressure that you can put on people, opening up the Echoing Horn, can allow you to cheese wins in all sorts of situations. I've cheesed wins against Ghost Rider. I've cheesed many times against things like ADP, where they're forced to put down Crobats to Denes for their early game pushes. And yeah, just the tempo of 180 is absolutely silly. So yeah, I believe Urshifu with the Telescopic Persimmon package will be the best way to play the archetype, and slightly trumping the old faithful that we have come to know. At the same time, there is potential to play Urshifu with Zeraora. I'm going to put this in tier 2, where you have the potential to use Koko Prism Star Lightning Energies and have Zeraora as a sort of follow-up attack. Once you've done your first Gmax Rapid Flow, you could then move into Zeraora just by finding a Rapid Strike Energy and using a Koko to pop, and then you do 100 to the active and 160 to the bench, which again can be buffed. I think really you just cut too many spaces. Already you're making spaces right now in this sort of build for a couple telescopics and 1 to 2 Persimmon, and having like additional basic energies, having a split between like lightning energy and basic fighting is a little bit awkward as well. Because you still need to have some basic energies that can fulfill Urshifu's attack cost. Otherwise, you lose to a lone Calyrex, basic Calyrex that just uses the Chaos Wheel attack and stops you attaching Rapid Strike energies. So you need to play basic fightings in some form as well as basic lightning, which is a little bit grim. So I think this is just a less consistent build of Urshifu right now. The payoff is nice with Zeraora being extremely threatening, but I think the sniping pressure that we have already with Urshi is going to be exemplified enough with the Persimmon build. So that's where we'll have that guy. I'm also going to go ahead and put Urshifu Cincino in tier 2 as well. Its results just aren't as strong as the Jirachi package, and I can't see that changing. This has way less space to play aggressive cards that we gain from Chilling Reign, and you can't really work towards like a Cheryl package when Ghost Rider is lingering around. So I think this does lose a little bit of steam and probably bottom of tier 2, maybe top of tier 3. I think it basically fades out of existence as we move more towards aggressive packages overall. Let's have a look at some other interesting stuff. Let's talk about Alcremie, Ghost Rider. Let's get some more of these archetypes knocked out. I actually think this is going to be tier 2 at best. I think this could even be too kind to the archetype. I think it's going to be a little bit inconsistent compared to other things. The payoff is there, and I think it's strong in Mirror, which is the only thing that makes me kind of interested in the idea. But outside of helping your mirror match, I think this just has a naturally worse matchup spread. You basically sacrifice all spaces to instantly lose the Eterna matchup. You're also worse into ADP because you don't have Horror House available, or if you do, you're like fitting even more stuff into the deck, and you're trying to get multiple stage 1s into play aggressively, whilst also having like Cresselia for early acceleration to get the most out of Gmax Whisk, I think it's called. So yeah, I think this is just like a dreamer build where you have to draw the absolute nuts to get it rolling, and quite often it will fall on its face. So tier 2 at the highest end, it will, you know, because it can knock out VMAXs, there's some power behind it, and it has better reload with even just like mid-range damage from the Alcremie on future turns. And obviously shuffling all those energies back into your deck can help out with the Ghost Riders to like stamp and Marnie proof yourself, but only to some extent, and that's really down to you getting multiple horses into play, and sometimes your opening hands just won't get that rolling because you need to prioritize ball search on Alcremies and even Cresselias in the opening turns. So I think that's a little bit rough for the deck overall. Lucmetal Zacian, I want to put this up in tier 1. I think it's proven itself time and time again. I think there is a small amount of concern for things like Blaziken coming out, but not huge enough for me to be worried about the Lucmetal. I think it's solidly tier 1. Can be annoying for Ghost Rider because of the resistance to Psychic that Lucmetal has, as well as just the raw bulk of Zamazenta in the sort of matchup. Yes, they'll play things like Trevnoir and Gengar Mimikyu, but these aren't the most scary for you. Lucmetal can maintain a fairly low hand size quite often. So the Gengar's not dangerous, and the Trevnoir isn't too dangerous when you've already set up the attacker, and you can also Intrepid Sword your way out of grim hands at the same time. So I think you're just naturally annoying for the Ghost Rider deck. Even if Ghost Rider is going to play things like Cheryl, it takes so many energies to be in play for you to like even get through a Zamazenta. So I think that's just not super viable for them. So I think Lucmetal continues to be just very, very good. The Urshifu matchup didn't get much worse either. This sniping from the bench compared to like a dojo isn't too different. Eternatus probably will be playing Phoebe, I should say. And now Galarian Moltres is a little bit of early pressure and some energy recursion, so you can't just like hammer them out of the game if you go down a hammer approach. but it's more or less kind of the same, I would say. So yeah, still seems very, very solid in the game. I want to go ahead and put Senti in tier... I'm going to put it top of tier 2. It hasn't really had the performances in this format, and I think that's a bit of an injustice to how strong this archetype is in the metagame placement right now. I think this card can still get out of control. Ghost Cali doesn't put a huge amount of pressure on in the opening stages outside of Horror House. But even then, you can try and use Centiskorch's first attack to remove an energy from the Gengar and make life difficult for them, where they have to pivot in and out to even attack you the following turn. So there's some plays you can make there with the Centiskorch. You can even like turn 1 Welder attack with a Heatran into Gengar as they like GX and then they immediately get knocked out. So yeah, there's some plays you can make as this deck. The only thing about Senti is like going second into the Ice Rider matchup, going second into Inteleon now is basically auto loss. Going second into the Victini matchup is also very bad, so it just feels a little bit worse than Victini, but I still think this is a viable deck in the game. I still think it boasts one of the better win rates against ADP, which at the moment is like the unchallenged tier S deck, I want to say, so yeah. Victini we're going to put in tier 1 as well. I think there's a good amount of tier 1 decks, to be honest. These are all like extremely viable archetypes, and I think this is the best way to play Fire right now. Had a huge resurgence with the addition of Galarian Rapidash, where you just have extra bench pressure alongside Cram. And I think this is, again, just very, very solid. You can set up things looking to VMAX. You can set up tag teams that much, like way easier than you could previously with Victini, and just gives you more pressure in those sorts of situations. So I think that's very cool. One thing I could say as well is that Rapidash could make its way into many of the Ghost Rider decks, even as just a 1 count for similar pressure that we see with Victini. And taking a little bit of pressure away from Boss. So yeah, Victini doesn't really gain much. You could have the addition of what's the thing called? Echoing Horn. And if you play Echoing Horn, it means you could maybe get back Crobats from your opponent's board that you knocked out to boss them back up, Eldergosses, that sort of thing as well. Or even if you're going for Cram Snipes, you could get back their Dedenes. So it could be another way that Victini can close games and sort of ignore board states, which I think is kind of nice, because obviously Victini VMAX is an extremely strong attack, but only into V Pokemon. So making them come back into play, obviously good news for you. So yeah, let's see what else is going on in here. Some other ones. Let's just bash up the Blissies. I think these are both fun archetypes. The Porygon Z and the Buzzmosa that's going to be playing Aurora's Metal, Saucers, and Bronzong. That's going to have some huge highlight reels, and I think it's going to be super fun to play, but pretty memey. Porygon Z is also going to be like some memey fun. You can go really aggressive with like researchers and play a silly amount of energy now in the deck, which I think is nice. You could even play Peony as well to try and get like Incense Candy going, which I think is pretty solid. Especially because it's just more hand discard, which helps the Blissey early game attack, which hopefully, in theory, allows you to get like more powerful colors instantly attached for the following turn damage pressure. But ultimately, we've seen that these decks like peter out way too often and aren't super strong. So yeah. Also in some of the lower tiers, I'm going to put Dragfu. It's one of those things where we've seen the benefits of having double typing. Dragapult's hitting for weakness is becoming less relevant because Mewtwo is less of the answer to Urshifu now. It's more going to be towards the Ghost Cali, so you want to find basically a new tech partner, so I think this becomes much more obscure. Straight Dragapult as well, I think, is pretty obscure at this point. It's not done too well. It's like just about held on in that like top 15 or so deck spot. But Urshifu is challenged, and this is currently like the thing trying to be the foil to Urshi. That'll be changing in the next set. Things to think about as well, because there's potentially more dark Pokemon around, which is obviously awkward because they're basically getting caught in the crossfire of the Ghost Calyrex. So yeah. Mad Party is an interesting one. It actually is scared of Ghost Cali because they have sprinkle damage. They can target 2 Pokemon and place 5 counters on each of them. The deck is likely to be Horror Housing as well, which I think is really awkward because having just like 1 teapot out or something can happen quite a lot, or you just don't have your attachment established and they Horror House into you, take those first prizes, and then start sprinkling on future turns. That becomes very, very scary because they can deal with your Sinisties before they become Pulties, and that's just going to be very, very rough. So you basically, like, you have to bench things to not lose to Horror House, but as soon as you bench things, they Horror House in the following turn. If they make enough VMAXs and then get a regular V sprinkling damage, they can wipe your board out even if you find like the Bunnelby, the Twin Energy and stuff, you need to start slamming down more Dedene's, Crobats, and all that good stuff for easy targets for them later on. So I think that is going to challenge the deck and put it down to a tier 2 archetype. This is also one of these decks that's trying to cash in on Urshifu right now, which may be having a small dip. Still scared of ADP. Victini can tech if it really wants to with things like Stoutland, if they really feel like it. Urshifu is going to be more sniping based, but that's pretty winnable for this archetype. I think one thing going for you is that Eterna won't be playing Power Plant too much anymore, which slightly helps the matchup. But in general, I'm a little bit worried how Ghost Rider can wall you out by sprinkling damage, and also they have that attack that does 10 and you can't play special energies, so they insta win. So maybe even dropping this to tier 3 just because Ghost Cali is like laughing at you because they literally just stop you from playing the game altogether. Yeah, let's say that. Let's put this down to tier 3, which is pretty rough. Let's go ahead and put a different one prize deck up in tier 2 then. We're going to put Spikemuth Spiritomb up here, trying to be that other dark type presence potentially in the format, where you're trying to capitalize on Ghost matchup, of course, and we've seen that Spikemuth can, raise the temperature quite quickly and make Spiritombs pretty aggressive. I feel like there's always a place for like some one prize decks to be in the metagame, and this one does have a decent damage cap available and boasts good type coverage. There's not too much to like dislike here. I think the consistency isn't great behind it, but I think its typing is enough to make it relevant, and we've seen that happen time and time again in different formats where Spiritomb has popped back up when he's the best one prize option. I think that could be becoming the case. From there, we're going to go ahead and slam Pikarom into tier 1.5. I think it is slowly creeping down. The power of Hammer into the Eternatus matchup is far less good. Hammers aren't great into the Cali matchup, and Cali has great ways to one-shot you. It's just quite easy to reach the 250 mark. You can't use 240 mark, I should say. You can't use Mewtwo to be like that tankier tag team, and if you start a Mewtwo, which you still have to play Mewtwo to win the Urshifu matchup, if you just start one of those, you lose the game. Even just starting like Pikarom is really bad for you as well. They can quite easily like Horror House and make life awkward for the Pikarom player. So, and also, a lot of Pikarom's win condition is like Stamp and Hope, and that's not great into the Cali matchup either. So, yeah, things to be scared about for Pikarom. Everyone says like this never dies, but I actually think it's, it'll still be fine. It'll still be a top 10 deck, but probably towards the lower end of the spectrum, and it's finally starting to peter out that little bit, I want to say. Welder Mewtwo I'm going to put down towards the bottom end because we're very scared to play Mewtwo in this format because there's Ghost Cali coming in and around, and I think there's just better Welder decks that you could be playing. Look towards some of these VMAXs, I want to say. Boom Mewtwo, I think, is kind of an underrepresented deck right now and is quite strong, but in the Chilling Reign meta, we again have to be concerned by Ghost Rider. That GX attack will be really annoying for Ghost Cali, where you just take so many energy off the board and they're not doing too much damage, and obviously in that matchup you can try and get the early Super Grow with the Eggrow itself and just try and use grass attackers. So I don't think this is like completely dead. I want to put this around probably top of tier 2. Something like that. I feel like there is still a place for this kind of deck because the GX attacks that this deck has available does make it awkward for ADP. It's awkward for Victini just because it's playing lots of tag team Pokemon. It has answers to Lucmetal and some other stuff, and it can still tangle with Eternatus. Eternatus should have better reload, which is a little bit awkward. They can like immediately respond even if you wipe all energy and shuffle them back into the deck. So that's a small percentage point loss there against the Eterna matchup. But I think this is probably going to be sticking around where it is, to be honest. What else is there? Greenzard, I think, is not super consistent. It does gain Path to the Peak, which makes it more disruptive. Is there any other reason to really like this deck? I think looking at the decks that I've got in tier 1, it actually tangles fairly well with all of them. You don't like Horror House. You're pretty okay into the Ghost Rider, though, if you are just jamming early paths. Maybe bottom of tier 2 is the best place to put this. It's pretty okay into most of the top decks, I want to say. Yeah, we can bung this into... it doesn't have the results right now. Let's put it in tier 3. I'm going to put Single Strike in tier 3 as well. Doesn't change too much. You get potential Dark-type attackers. T-Tar could come into the deck. Survivor could come into the deck, but not too much. Now, a heavily centered Survivor build, I also think has a lot of promise, where you play Karens and Lanterns and Brunos and lots of Survivors, lots of Houndooms, obviously, and like 1 or 2 single strike Urshis, where you have good type coverage into a number of matchups. You're trying to hit Cali for weakness, trying to hit Eterna for weakness, Pikarom for weakness, and just in general be 1 and 2 prize Pokemon based and hope that the late game Karen push is enough to win games. I don't think this is super consistent and does rely on having lots of Houndooms out quite quickly, which I think is the main concern. But I do think there's a place for this deck, depending on how strong Cali gets. If Cali starts pushing towards the S rather than the tier 1, I can foresee this really making a foothold. But for now, I'm going to pop it in tier 2 around the mid to high region, I want to say. Green's Trevnoir, I think, is going to be a bit of a boogeyman. It really appreciates a format where there's less Crushing Hammer. And I think there will be less Crushings, because let's look at our top decks. ADP will only play Crushing if it only cares about Mirror now. Pikarom will still be playing Crushings. Eterna probably isn't going to be playing Crushing Hammers anymore, and decks don't beat Eterna as much as they used to just by jamming Crushing Hammer. So the value of Crushing goes down a little bit, I want to say. Lucmetal still could, but not many of them. I mean, it's about a 50-50 split. So really, we only expect like maybe ADP. Like I would say like 20-30% of ADPs, 20% of Eternas, and like 40% of Lucmetals. So I'm expecting less Hammer in the game, which I'm excited for. And looping back to the Trev Greens deck, it really appreciates no Hammer. The one thing I would bear in mind is things like Inteleon and Ice Rider could easily be playing things like Rugged Helmet. A few other archetypes could play Rugged Helmet, actually, just off the cuff. That could be a new like replacement for Crushing as like a guaranteed tempo removal. So a small thing to bear in mind there. But in general, if there's not much energy removal, that's really good for Trev. The one reason I'm going to put this down to tier 3 is that whenever it goes first, it's still just like way too slow to get working. You absolutely have to go second with this deck to get crest value, otherwise you're super sad. So yeah. Finally, we have a couple of Blaziken archetypes. There's Blaziken Zeraora, which I think is ultimately a worse sniping deck than Urshifu, but it does have some type coveraging going for it. It's going to make it threatening for the ADP matchup. It's going to be annoying for a few other archetypes out here as well. Obviously, you don't run into this weakness map where you're scared to face like one of these 3, and you're happy to face Lucmetal and ADP. Like that's a pretty good spot to be in. So for that reason, I'm going to actually bump this to 1.5. I do think this will be a contender thanks to being similar to Victini, where you can compete with these guys and you're not completely dead to these 3. So your matchup spread is like a couple positives and then like neutrals, which I think is really not a bad place. And you have some power behind you. Zeraora, really threatening, snipe pressure. Obviously can gobble up Crobats, Dedenes, that sort of thing. But can even deal with evolving V Pokemon with the help of Persimmon plus the Telescopic. So yeah, dangerous deck out there, just be warned. And then finally, I will put the Cheryl Pidgeotto approach in tier 3. We've seen this with Snorlax VMAX. We've seen it from Sander playing Centiskorch VMAX as well. The Senti build is definitely more on the defensive disruption side, and I think that's probably better than playing Blaziken. Now, I do think Blaziken is better than Snorlax Pidgeotto because you can retain energies much more easily, so that's not something you have to spend turns using Munchlax to recover. So you can maintain a game plan much more aggressively just by putting a constant 120 in the face of the opponent and wiping off damage. But at the same time, that can be easily gotten around by a lot of sniping pressure that we have in the game right now. We have ADP, which is always going to be a foil for this type of engine because you have to build Pidgeottos, you have to put Munchlax down, that sort of thing. And ADP is always going to just have extra gusting options. Even things like Echoing Horn could end up losing you the game for this type of deck because if you just discard a Blaziken, they can get it back and gust it up and take a 3-prize knockout. So I think this is a little bit particular, a little bit... yeah, just a little bit awkward to deal with. All sorts of the decks at the top. I think that it can stumble at different hurdles. It has an unconventional engine, which makes me a little bit scared. But that's not to say that I don't like this whole Cheryl loop style VMAX. I think it's definitely a great way to exploit the game right now, and the lack of like damage that can go all the way up to one-shotting VMAXs. Ghost Cali could if they play like 14, 15 energy builds of Psychic Energy, but if they're playing like high Auroras, it doesn't always come off. So there aren't many decks that can straight up wipe out a Blaze. The one thing I'd say is like potentially Inteleon, Ice Rider, if they start creeping up the list that little bit more, that will start to be the case, and you can't really tank with Blaziken, and you have to go back to Snorlax, which at the moment doesn't have a lot of results behind it. Yes, it's a difficult deck to play, and it is more of like an exhibition of a deck rather than actually like hyper competitive. But I did want to just mention Blaziken as potentially a new option for it. That was a lot of talking. I'm very out of breath. Let me know what you think about my tier list. Yes, I'm sure some of these could go up and down certain places. I'm trying to take things with a pinch of salt, where I'm expecting somewhat of a meta change, but not a huge amount. I think the biggest thing that will change is that there will be various Ghost Rider decks popping up. There's going to still be Urshifu. There's going to still be Eternatus, no doubt. There's still going to be the Zacian decks out there. Blaziken's the biggest question mark for me. Will it actually be that breakout performer that becomes a new element of spice in some of these top decks, or does it just not have the power / consistency to really keep up? Outside of that, I'm really excited to see the Melanie decks and how they perform. I've rated them both at tier 2 right now. That could also be that little bit too low. Again, it really depends on how far Victini actually jumps up the list. I think Victini won't be changing too much until the tag teams rotate. It's going to still suffer the same issues that it does right now. But post-rotation, the water decks may be the only answer to Victini. So that's, again, a story for another day. Hope you did enjoy it, guys. I'm going to go ahead and put this tier list in the description below as well if you want to make your own, so go ahead and do that. Thanks so much for watching. Leave a like if you did, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I've been Joe from Omnipoke, and I will see you guys next time. Cheers.